Hello, and welcome to this latest podcast in the series The Law, the Facts and Life Back on Track. I'm Julie Marsh, a partner in the medical negligence team at Boys Turner Solicitors. For those of you who have listened before, you'll know that I act on behalf of severely injured people who have suffered their injury as a result of medical negligence. If you've not listened before, well, now you know who I am. Welcome and thanks for listening. Today, I'm talking to Kate Gibbons, Senior Rehabilitation Case Manager from Emma Way Associates. Welcome, Kate, and thank you for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me.
So today I've invited Kate to join me to talk about her role as a case manager, working with and supporting people who have suffered an amputation. The injury might have been sustained as a result of poor medical treatment, but might also have been sustained as a result of a road traffic accident or an injury at work. Kate and I met a few years ago when we were working with a young female client who had sustained bilateral mid-foot amputations as a result of a delay in diagnosis and treatment of meningitis. It was as a result of working with her on that case that I've invited her today to share with me her experience of working as a case manager with clients who've suffered amputation, but also to talk about how a case manager can help in practical ways that, sadly as a lawyer, I never can. So to start today, Kate, perhaps I can ask you to introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your training and background and how you came to work in your current case manager role.
Well, I trained as a physio at the Uni of Manchester, and then after a short break to go travelling, I worked across several of the London teaching hospitals as a basic grade physiotherapist, and then stayed there to go on to my senior rotations. Towards the end of that period, I started to do some private work in the community, and it was during that I probably stumbled across what I now know to be the case manager role. I was treating an elderly lady in her home. She'd had a stroke, and on one occasion that really sticks in my mind, I arrived at her house. She was alone, she'd not had anything to eat or drink that day, and had all the symptoms of a UTI and feeling quite desperate. And I just stood there thinking, this is pointless. There's no point in me treating her hand function. It's not really important today. And instead, I spent the time getting a GP review and sorting out some help for the following days. Once I realised that role existed in reality, I went on to work at the London Centre for Spinal Cord Injuries at Stanmore in their case management team and loved it.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting that you were within that kind of setting and then realised that you had to step outside of your role in order to kind of help somebody and make progress for them.
Just to say on that, I think it's quite, at that time, it was probably quite new for physios to be working as a case manager. So I did feel, I was a bit alone, but now more and more, it's probably even Stevens across physios, OTs and social workers and some nurses. So yeah, it's been quite an interesting development.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So perhaps that's a good time for us to explain a little bit about what a case manager is, what they do, and what the job kind of broadly entails and involves.
I suppose the formal answer is that we coordinate a programme of rehabilitation to restore an injured individual as far as money allows to how they were prior to the accident or index event. When I've tried to explain my job to friends before now, they reply with, so you project manage an injured individual. And I suppose in a way that's quite a good description. But our roles are really broad as case managers. We cover various areas, focusing on care and support, accommodation, medical and therapy interventions, looking at how, transport modes, how a person is getting around, social and leisure, as well as, their education or employment situation. We'll create a team of people to work with each individual to manage their needs. We then monitor the progress and keep reviewing and updating that plan and changing what's happening to make sure that we're meeting those needs.
That's really interesting. I quite like the image of a project manager because you do often have so many different moving parts to control.
Different hats.
Different hats. Yeah, and I know we've had a conversation in the past about all the different hats that I quite often wear as a litigator. So I can imagine there are many more hats as a case manager, but always working towards that one kind of overarching aim of getting that person to the best position they can possibly be within the environment.
Exactly.
So in cases involving medical negligence, a case manager does not typically get involved until liability has been admitted and then interim funds are available to meet the cost of the case manager and the therapy, equipment and other recommendations that are then made. The situation's a bit different when a case involves personal injury, maybe arising from a road traffic accident or accident at work, where the rehab code generally means rehabilitation support can be accessed earlier. This means that it can be some significant time following the index event or injury in a medical negligence case before someone can access rehab and get the right support. So what are the key issues with coming on board as a case manager later down the line, for example, in an amputation injury, that are kind of important to consider and that are different?
Yeah, well, I think often the delay can mean that injured person has had a period of trying to cope and just putting up with, issues that have arisen. And in some instances, I think that can become so normal that they just accept it and they don't realise how hard they're having to work just to manage the processes of daily life. Often after an amputation, what we see is that the NHS don't want to provide prosthetic input until the stump volume fluctuation has settled. And again, following that, the input isn't always available in as timely a manner as we'd like it to be, nor offering the best possible options. And this means that by the time a case manager gets involved, the treating team that we put in place have to spend time undoing bad habits or dealing with issues before they can actually progress forwards. We've also got, deconditioning can be quite a big factor. It's likely that an individual will have become weaker and less fit from that immediate period after the accident or event. And then in lots of cases, people are dealing with psychological trauma and they've not got the insight or motivation to engage in the brief bit of home exercises that may have been recommended, and without proper decent support. So that just becomes even more of an issue. That lack of access to support for mental health conditions post-amputation can really lead to some significant longer term issues. And I think that really means for us that when some good therapy gets put in, it can't progress in the same way, and you're dealing with an awful lot more than just the trauma of the injury or event that led to the amputation. And of course, grief. These people are dealing with so much. It's such a catastrophic thing to have happened in their life. And that needs careful handling by a suitable professional. When that's not in place, the impact can be wider than just on the individual. Their ability will have changed, their mobility level. And then if their psychological well-being is also impacted, other members of the family are also then equally impacted. And I think in some circumstances, sadly, that leads to relationship breakdowns. So without that quick, suitable, appropriate support, it can spiral very quickly. So I do strongly believe and see evidence of regularly that early intervention leads to better functional outcomes.
And that's certainly what we saw in the case that we worked on together.
Absolutely.
There was a real mental block around the help and support that was out there and about the benefits of certain therapy. And actually, even though you come from a position of educated and knowing what benefit that support can really bring to that individual, you've got to convince them of that to start with because they haven't had that input at the outset.
Yeah.
And certainly a lot of the clients that I work with are still grieving for what they've lost and still struggling to come to terms with what the new normal life looks like, and are having to battle through, and all of a sudden to be told, oh, well, actually you can have physiotherapy and hydrotherapy and there's this aids and equipment that might help and all the rest of it. That's a real mind shift for clients to have to kind of deal with as well.
And such a big impact in their life as well. It takes an awful lot of their time on a day-to-day basis. And if they've found a way to just manage and crack on, that might not be doing them good in some respects. They may be walking really badly or moving really badly. And, longer term, that's just not going to last. And it's certainly not going to put them back into the best situation they can be in, but they just manage it. And so to stop doing that, to take a step off that and then re-engage in a program is quite hard.
And it takes a lot of energy, a lot of commitment and a lot of positive motivation, whereas it's sometimes just easier to revert to, oh, well, I was managing before, so what's the problem? Yeah. So when you're coming in as a new case manager with a new amputation client, what are the kind of key issues that you're often looking at?
I think primarily it's key to find out what their life looked like prior to the amputation, an event that led to that. how they functioned personally on a day-to-day basis, professionally, within their family and the wider community. And then the key issues really are all those covered in an immediate needs assessment. So history of input to date, what's in place in terms of care, medical and therapy provision, any changes that have been done to their home, school, work situation, how they're accessing the community, and the impact on their leisure pursuits. I've had occasions where there is an issue of critical importance, and this really might need immediate input. For example, it might be psychological support even prior to the INR being completed and reviewed by all the legal teams. And I've had times where I've made a request and it's been funded before they've even seen the INR, which has been really positive. And I think it's always important to consider what I, as a case manager, would recommend and what is going to make a big difference. But it's critical to think about that person's priorities as well.
Which leads me on to my next question, which was really, how do you prioritise with a person the next steps in their rehab journey and identify which direction to go in first? Because you as a professional will have a view, but obviously they as an individual will also have a view, and they're suddenly being presented with this whole range of opinions and advice, which sometimes can be really difficult to take on board. So how do you go through having those kind of preliminary discussions with somebody?
Yeah, well, what I try and do is outline, if I can, at the end of the face-to-face assessment with an individual, what I'm going to recommend in my reports. You're sort of scribbling notes all the time thinking, okay, yes, we've talked about that, so that's going to go in my recommendations. So if I can outline that and give them an idea of what I'm going to say, once the funds are hopefully agreed, I meet with them again and go through those recommendations and sort of ask them what their three main priorities are. And I think it's then useful for a case manager to offer advice on that, of what, we might feel might make the biggest difference and be the best way to approach those recommendations. But consider together that order and agree the focus, because, it is about them. It's all for them. So they've got to be on board with it. I think often accommodation is up there, but sometimes it can be really different. I can remember working as a physio once with a young mum, and the entire team had sort of agreed that the best immediate input would be to work on transfers and seating. Her focus was purely about how she was going to cuddle her newborn baby. So that was put as her number one goal. So I think, having those thoughts and considerations, that everyone is different, everyone is an individual. You can't just blanket treat everyone the same way, assuming that their injury might look the same. It's important to go in and review with that person how the process is going to work.
That's great. And so important, I think, that the person's on board with what those recommendations are and can identify from those recommendations, well, actually, this is my real priority. And as you say, remembering that the heart of all of this is the injured person and what they really want to achieve as their priority should be front and centre.
Yes.
And you mentioned there about accommodation, and I remember having conversations with you about our mutual clients' accommodation needs. And sometimes accommodation is a real big ticket item for a client. Sometimes it's their absolute priority. They're really struggling. But sometimes it's not, isn't it? It's sometimes much further down the list, as it were, in terms of priority. So when you're talking to a new amputation client, how does accommodation factor into your assessment?
So I'll always ask if I can have a look around the property, and if they're allowing me to take some photographs. So that will go into my report and provide an outline of, where it's located, how many bedrooms there are, what's on the ground floor, what might be upstairs, what changes have been made, what can and can't be accessed. And therefore you're sort of identifying any issues that they're having. I'm not an OT by background, so I will always want to get a further OT assessment to consider issues arising and recommendations moving forward. I think having a conversation at that early stage, it can be quite hard. You're often might be meeting someone who's lived in that house for 50 years or longer, and they don't want to leave it. It was never their intention to leave it. And although life is hard there, they're torn. So perhaps just, looking carefully at the situation that person's in, taking on board some of their comments that they've said, but highlighting at that early stage that it's just your comment from a professional's point of view that perhaps that home isn't enabling them as much as it could. And that might take a period of time, you know, as we saw in that case, that we needed a period of time for them to understand how much easier life could be in a different property. But I think early conversations are important, and honesty, but honesty from both parties. So I think, you know, taking on board how they're feeling at that point in time, and, you know, if it's not immediate, it may be further down the line, but for some people, as you say, it might be a high priority and something that we've got to make a difference to straight away.
And I think it is a conversation that has to be revisited, isn't it, over and over, because it evolves and changes. And as a person maybe becomes slightly more capable, actually that accommodation might then be more of a hindrance, or life might, as you say, just be a bit easier. So there's a period of adjustment. So having the early conversation, floating the idea that some changes might be needed, but also the way those changes can be accommodated. In the case we worked on, we looked at, you know, Airbnb, didn't we, as a short term trial period in different accommodation and on your own, which is a whole different ballgame to being in a house that you're familiar with and with family around you to support you in that accommodation. So it can be kind of looking and thinking outside the box in terms of meeting accommodation need.
Absolutely. And I think amputation clients are quite interesting, really, because they are hopefully, and in many cases, going to be walking for a significant period of their day each day. But it's likely that each day, and at other times, maybe for a longer periods, they're going to require the use of a wheelchair. So you're sort of managing two different situations, you know, that then they're not fully ambulant and they're not a full-time wheelchair user. So you're trying to work to two different requirements and make sure that both are equally good.
Yes, and that's interesting because as a litigator, I'm looking at an accommodation claim and future-proofing it. So inevitably there'll be a recommendation for single-storey accommodation. But of course, a young client who is hoping to be active with good prosthetic support and things will never want to be looking at a bungalow and living in an area with an older population, because they see themselves as kind of that pulls them out and marks them as having a disability.
Absolutely. And if they're, I think sometimes the younger they are, and it can be the more newly injured they are, if the process has been fairly smooth for them in terms of they've not had issues in their immediate recovery, they don't want to think about a bad day. So if they're up and they have had some prosthetic input and they're mobile and managing well for that period when you meet them, trying to have a discussion that there may be times when they're not going to be like that isn't always well received.
No, and also highlighting situations where you think this is absolutely a situation where you probably would want to be in single-storey accommodation because you've seen the range of issues that occur. So in that situation, we had a client who was thinking about having children, and we were trying to think about, well, do you really want to be in a property which is 2 stories when you're going to have to be mobilising up and down stairs on prosthetics? What if there is an emergency? You can't sprint up and down the stairs like a normal, non-injured person. And that was a difficult conversation to have, and something that they struggled to come to terms with, I think, to think about.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, you know, 3-floor lifts can be good, but they're not quick, they're not easy, they're not always in the right place in the property. As you say, they're not going to be as quick as running down the stairs.
So how does your role change and evolve during the life of the claim and then post-settlement as well, which is another real step change, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think I probably often find that people want their lives back for a while. They've had enough of the claims process, you know, people poking into their lives or feeling watched and monitored, I think, in a way. And many individuals, I think it's probably fair to say, you know, find the litigation process tiring and can be quite traumatizing in some cases. So they want to retreat, enjoy just being them for a while and having their life back. And hopefully, if that person has got to a stage in the lifetime of the claim where they've got a good supporting team, they know who to reach out to, and importantly, when to reach out, they can manage quite well. I can stay on hand for calls and advice as and when they need me. Some people do want to continue with the same level of case management input, which I can also do. And I think what we do find is those that want that break initially come back 12 months down the line or even later and ask for assistance again because perhaps something's gone wrong or is not working as well as it was. And that can sometimes be because simply they've just not kept up with the rehab program as much as they had been, because they want a break from everything. And things have just deteriorated a little and they need that encouragement, motivation, or just this pure suggestion to re-engage in that, have another burst and get back on track again. Sometimes if they've left it for a longer period, it can be almost like having a new client again, and we need to do a sort of full assessment to get them back on track. And what we see in a few cases is that I think people still look to a case manager for reassurance on costs. So whilst they've got their settlement, I think they do worry about what's a reasonable cost, and they like to chat through, a therapy suggestion or equipment costs, and certainly on accommodation. Again, it varies person to person, and I think if a case manager can be flexible to that, that can work really well.
Yes, I can totally understand how brutal people can find the litigation process and how intrusive. And I'm often talking to my clients about expert assessments from both parties, a number of expert assessments, people, as you say, poking into their lives, judging to a degree, offering recommendations, almost in a vacuum. And as a case manager, I suspect you have to diffuse some of what the litigation creates around those issues.
That's certainly a tough one. I think you can, that would almost require a separate little rehab program on its own sometimes, that you're managing the impact of the injury and then quite separately managing the impact of litigation. And that might not be on the injured person. We find certainly with youngsters, parents take on that stress and strain. Often with an injured person, for whatever reason, their spouse might take that on. And so you've then got two people that are being massively impacted then. So, yeah, lots to deal with.
And I think that's a particular issue with the litigation process, is that the claimant, the injured person, is always at the centre of it and the focus is always on them. But we have to try and remember the impact that it has on the wider family and those that are providing the care and support, and often have provided that care and support for such a significant period of time before then further intervention and help is available.
For sure. I had one case, a teenager, and I didn't get involved, or case manager didn't get involved for quite some time, by which point the parents have done such a fabulous job, to the best that they can do and using their knowledge. But then that's quite hard for them to hand over. So that took time to build a relationship, not just with the client, but with the parents as well, to allow me to support all of them and to take on things that they've just desperately held on to, as any parent would, I think, to, fight for their child. So I think the longer that goes on, the harder it is sometimes for case managers to get involved and really get a good handle on the case, because you've got to build a rapport first. I mean, you do in every case, but certainly the longer they coped for, you're dealing with that as well.
Yes, and I think we find as litigators sometimes the hardest part is actually handing over the relationship to the case manager, because we play case manager for a period of time before a case manager is instructed, and then because you've been involved in that person's life or the family's life for so long, they then have to start over with somebody new, and they sometimes feel like you're kind of washing your hands off them.
Yeah, I can see that. But I think they know, if a case manager comes in and talks to all the team about that support network, when I said earlier about once someone's finished, you settled their claim, finished with the litigation, that as long as they know the right people and the right time to make contact with for whatever their needs are. And I think at any stage, if you just say, look, this is that person, they're still within your support network, so they're always there. Don't ever feel you can't ask them. It's not that you've got to come to me. It's just that I can help you with these things. And hopefully, if you form a good MDT, if an individual is reaching out to one person about something that's perhaps not quite their role, they will then pass it on. And that's the benefits of a strong MDT.
Yeah, and that's so important. We see that time and again, how important it is to have that MDT around the injured person. Thank you so much for joining me today, Kate, to discuss such an interesting topic and what I think must be a very complex and often very challenging role. It's been great to understand the issues and talk generally about the benefit of a case manager and what they can bring to an injured person.
Thanks for having me, Julie. Always happy to chat about case management.
Thank you for tuning in. I do hope that you've enjoyed listening to this podcast. And if you or anyone you know has experienced an injury or amputation as a result of poor medical care, or want to inquire about making a complaint or bringing a claim, our contact details can be found on our website, boysturnerclaims.com.